All right, at least we got that going. I'll just show you what I was up against. I wanted to refer to one of my favorite sites, Steve Gregg, The Narrow Path. And as of today, I'm going to share this so the people at home can see. Okay, share. As of today, when I go to The Narrow Path, here's what I get.
Oh.
Your connection is not private. Attackers may be trying to steal your information from thenarrowpath.com. Normally on this, if it's just the little HTTP and it doesn't have an S like our church website, I can go and say, go anyway, I know it's okay. This one doesn't give me that option, so I couldn't work around it. I thought, well, maybe it's my Chrome. So I went into Edge. No, maybe it's my computer. I went to this, so I can't get through. So part of what I wanted to try and access today is just not stubbornly not available. Maybe it's an issue with Steve's site. I have no idea, but be that as it may, we're gonna plug along with plans C, D, and E, if with your indulgence anyway. Oh, hi, Lois.
Morning. Hi, Lois. Oh, I see it now.
Yeah.
Surgeries, March 11th.
March 11th now.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh,
That's your
okay.
surgery? Yeah.
Oh, good.
And I said, one good thing with between that, I can get the epidural on my back.
Okay.
Steve, sorry. No, we don't know when Steve.
We don't know Steve's.
We won't know after February 5th.
I have to go. So.
Okay, well, I want to take a little time to reflect. Kathy has suggested that we, with Easter a few months on the horizon, we may be a little early on this, but Max Lucado is a popular writer of Christian books and videos and blogs and all those kinds of things. Has a series called He Chose the Nails. And it's especially appropriate leading up to Lent and Easter. So I've looked into that. And I want to give you a little preview. If you know anything of Max Lucado, you can feedback on that. If you don't, I've got a nice little 7-minute preview here that will kind of give you an idea, and then you can steer me if we want to go that direction. I have looked at the cheapskate route that I like, and his book and the workbook for this are available to me because I have a library card with Maricopa County Library, and they have an ebook service called Hoopla, and so I can get his book free for 3 months, or 21 days, I guess, 3 weeks, and renew it. So there's a way to, if you have a library card, I'm guessing there are ways that you can access the printed materials or the electronic materials and not have to buy anything. If you prefer to make a purchase, it's modest. If we decide to do this, but today we can kind of look at that. And I was going to save that toward the end, though. I just want to plant the seed now. We'll do our thing before that. I'll play this little 7-minute video of Max Lucado. We can talk over if that would be a fruitful way. It'd be different than what we've done before, which might be a nice change of pace. I don't know. I'll leave that up to you. Okay, I want to do a little review and quiz. Yeah, lock the doors. If I can, let me get off of this screen here and come back to us. Okay.
Yes, it says it.
Reflecting on what we have done here in our many, many weeks of Bible study together, how it's taken shape, how it's evolved over time, some of the topics that we've covered, other ones that we've have yet to cover. And I would like to ask if there are things that have stuck with you or have changed the way that you approach the Bible. Do you have any different Bible study practices or techniques? Do you use those, or is there something you're wanting? So let you think on that for a little while and get us started. When we come to the Bible, we know it's a collected series of what we'll call books, even though most of them are not very lengthy. Some of them So it's a collection of 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. And we have learned about some of those things. The Bible is organized not chronologically, so Genesis wasn't the first thing written. In fact, we probably would have a difficulty really knowing chronologically. We can guess. Some of the oldest things we have are the Psalms. They go back to the Canaanite period of all things. Pretty amazing. But the Bible is organized into the Torah, which means what in English? Anybody know? Okay, it's the law. Traditionally, the Torah is how many? Did I say already how many books of the Bible? The first Torah is the first how many books of the Bible?
9,
Five.
5,
Okay, first 5 books of the Bible,
yeah.
and they are used even today in the Jewish community and in the Christian community as the Jewish people call that the law. It is more than just a series of laws, but it is the story of creation leading up to the fall and the flood, the stories of the patriarchs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the 12 sons, and how Joseph was sold into slavery, and the perseverance and the make the best of it attitude that he had, trust in God, turned that into a rescue when there was a famine in Israel and Joseph had risen to power and had stored up food, was able to save many people, including his own brothers that sold him into slavery. And then in that period, the people Israel in Egypt grew stronger, and the Pharaoh, after the time of Joseph, got afraid of how strong these people were becoming and enslaved them and exercised a forceful dominion over them. And yet they still continued to grow. And that period is said to be 400 years of slavery. God acted in hearing the cries of his people and said it's time to break those bonds. And so in order to have a leader for them to come out of that period of slavery, God appeared to someone who had history in Egypt, rather, but fled after having lost his temper and killed a man. And he was tending the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro in a field, and his name was
Moses.
Moses. Thank you, Pam. And Moses was tending the flocks, minding his own business, and was called away by something very peculiar, which was
Burning bush.
burning bush. Thank you, Patty. So I'm testing your minds. I'm trying to get the wheels greased here to give a little history. All right. And at the burning bush, Moses approached, and we have this story that he was fascinated that this appeared to be a burning bush, but it wasn't consumed by the fire. And he heard a voice, whether audibly or whether through some other form of revelation that God chose. I can't prove one way or the other, but it's presented in narrative form, a story, so that we can grasp it. And the bush was coming to Moses for a purpose. And what was that purpose? What was Moses going to be asked to do?
Lead them out of Egypt.
Okay, so you're all on board with that? Okay. Do you remember anything about Moses' response?
I can't do it.
Okay. Well, yeah. Oh, I thought you meant you couldn't remember. No, she's right. That was his response. It's surely God, not me. I'm not eloquent. I'm not the one need for this. This is beyond me. I like to review this because all of us in our calling to ministry in various forms, mine eventually first as a ruling elder, then as a pastor, there's part of me that says I'm not the right one for this. I ran away from the calling to ministry for most of my life, thinking that God just wasn't picking the right person. And God persists in that. So he's convincing Moses that he has a task for him to lead the people out of slavery in Egypt to a land of promise. So as he's trying to convince Moses of this and Moses protests, God answers him, for example, I'm not eloquent, I don't speak well to people. God made a provision for that. And that was his brother Aaron, who was more prone to have those gifts. So God was not only calling, but proving that God would equip with what was needed. One of the other things that Moses was lacking in was confidence. He thought maybe returning to Egypt, he might be held on trial for murder. He didn't think that people would listen to him. He certainly didn't think Pharaoh was going to receive him or listen to him. And so he said, I don't have confidence for this. Who should I say sent me? All right. Now, what do you remember about God's response? Whom shall I say sent me? He asks the burning bush, and the burning bush replies,
I am. Is that when he said that?
yeah. And that's that weird phrase that is really untranslatable. We have it as I am that I am. I am who I am. I am what I will be. I've talked to you about how that is. I come into your existence. I'm involved. Those are all ways you can understand that. There is no to be verb in Hebrew, so I am is really not, it's just the best we can do to try and translate it. But God was moving out of their idea of transcendent to also being immanent and involved. And he was going to not only call Moses, but equip Moses for everything that Moses needed to do. Now, that didn't just make it happen like that. And there was stops and starts, and Moses doubted, and Pharaoh didn't listen, and there's the whole story. But how does that process of Moses living his life, having had situations where he had success, but then he had a terrible failure, ran away from that failure, and then was surprised by God and now given a task, protested against that task, and was led into doing it with the equipping of God through a series of difficulties, and became, for the people Israel and for us, God's great prophet, Moses. How does that story impact you? How do you reflect on it? How does it inform your journey? Can we take some time? I'd like to get some responses. Have you even thought about it? And if not, this is a good time to do so. Why is that story so profound and prolific, not just in and of itself, so that we can read about what Moses did and what God did in those circumstances? Does it have any resonance for, okay, so this is how people are, and this is how God is, and this is how the interaction is, and that informs, I'm a people, so God knows how I am. God is God, we interact. Is that one story had any impact, or could it have any impact on where you've been in your life? Does anyone have any reflection? Welcome, Ethel. Oh, now she's in focus. There we go. All right. So is there any brave soul that might reflect?
So is the question how it impacts our life or
Informs?
or how it
Yeah.
informs
Does
us?
Moses' story and how God responded, does any of that inform how we understand ourselves, God?
Well, for me, in doing and working on Christian and virtues, which is perseverance, Moses, along with many other persons who were chosen to serve and show how they serve God, it was about perseverance. It was about there are mountains, there are valleys. There's nothing such as 100% perfect. Everything's going to fall in line for you. But perseverance is like a trial. If you go through it, it is something that creates your relationship with God and how your faith grows on your faith journey.
Okay. So there's a perseverance angle. Yeah, that was, imagine the ups and downs and the stops and starts.
And I can't imagine how frustrated he must have been, not only to be a Pharaoh, and here he is in the life of the protection of the Pharaoh and serving with, as being looked up to. And now all of a sudden, his life totally turns around. And then you have all of the, when the Egyptians wouldn't let the Israelites go, you have then all of the different plagues. And then the people followed him and they just wandered and they questioned his authority.
Yes.
They questioned the faith in God so much that they built idols. Nothing was perfect. He had to have been of such agitation and anger and God, I'm doing this for you, but yet nothing's going right. What am I doing wrong? Am I doing something wrong? And yet, and the saddest part for me about Moses is that he wasn't able to go to Canaan, the Holy Land that was promised.
He only got to see it from a
He only
distance.
got to see it from a distance. But
Boy, what life lessons, really? I mean, isn't that amazing? I mean, just if I put myself in Moses' shoes and see, okay, he had to be cajoled and convinced, but he finally came through and he did all of these things at great personal peril and energy, expense and at various times along the way, the very people he was serving grumbled against him and threatened him. And he had to go to God and say, what will I do with these people? And probably was tempted at times to even want to give up. What a life lesson.
I would say that on that page, that he uses imperfect people to help.
God uses imperfect people. And a theological word for that might be redemption. Moses certainly had a lot of failings. He was a murderer, apparently. He thought it was justice at the time what he was doing, and that can be debated. But he killed a man. And people wanted to try and hold him accountable for that, and he ran away. Gee, why would God pick a person like that? Well, would God pick a person like me? So there's a redemption factor. And there's also a repentance and a coming to accept responsibility. So yeah, so we've got perseverance, we've got leadership, we've got redemption. What else? Anything else resonate with you? We're talking about June, Moses. I'm talking about the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, doing a little review and quiz time here, but I'm wanting to get some feedback. And so we've paused on Moses at the burning bush and the story of Moses being called by God, being reluctant, having to be cajoled and equipped, sent on this odyssey of a journey with the impossible task of going before Pharaoh and pleading for the freeing of the people, and finally leaving after the plagues and going through the wilderness and being delayed for 40 years and the grumbling and the 10 commandments and the idols and all that stuff. So, and I'm wanting to just have people reflect on how Moses' story and how God appeared at that time, what it tells us about people, what it tells us about God, and how we interact, and does that inform us in any way personally or as a church or as a community? So we've got redemption, we've got perseverance, we've got leadership.
Yeah, I just always thought that anybody in the Bible that the Lord directs to do something, regardless of the circumstances or who they are, means that we should all be in that position to try to help others in the manner of pleasing Him, no matter what. That's why I've always felt about everyone in the Bible.
Kind of like role models.
Okay.
I think too, the essence that if, and I like how Kathy phrased that, people who were imperfect were chosen to do something for God, which of course would be the ultimate. Because in a way, each of those persons that was mentioned on Sunday that had gone through all the struggles, but they persevered in their faith. Actually, all of us, each one of us at this table have gone through some valleys and mountains, whether it's a death of a loved one, whether it is your own relationships in the world or your family or even your personal life. And it shows that, like, it's like the saying of footprints. When you look on the sand on the beach and you see only 2 feet,
Mhm.
and you say, God, why weren't you with me? And then you realize the essence of that is because Jesus was carrying us. And I think that all of their stories say that no matter what, the end result, whether it was perfect for them, like Moses didn't get to go and live in the Holy Land,
Mhm.
but for, like Jim was saying, because of the modeling of what they all persevered through, it helps us understand that no matter what the end result is your faith in God strong, and it will get you through no matter what. He will never forsake you. You are always with someone, even if you're alone by yourself. God is always with you.
So,
And
and then,
with my, hip surgery being, first having the original hip surgery and then having it dislocated 3 times and then, and then having the surgery and then postponing it,
40 years is almost
and so, I have, and I try to keep a good attitude about it, God, I know God's with me and He's watching over me.
There are reasons, like you said, you're going to go on Medicare on the 1st of March,
Yeah,
and therefore you will be cared for.
yeah,
And it was hard knowing that Steve then was going to have surgery and
Yeah.
everything conflicting, and that was hard.
Does he have a date?
not yet. He sees the doctor February 5th.
February?
Yeah.
Why?
That is the earliest the surgeon would get him in for the initial, because he only was in the office 1 day a week. His surgery for follow-ups, 4 days a week. But he only sees patients 1 day a week in the office.
other reflections on how this one story, which is a compilation of many stories, of Moses and God and how it tells us about people and God and a relationship with one another. Anything else that you want to observe that people draw from that, or that you might draw from that?
And so leadership, so servant leadership, but then a true leader then is a servant. A true leader would be a servant, but a servant needs support, or the leader still needs support.
I think it's a great testament to faith,
Yes.
just blind faith.
Exactly. Exactly. Not knowing, not seeing, just
Scared,
Mhm.
insecure.
I think of your grief classes and what you guys do. That is so much tied to this, you feel like the rug's pulled out from under you, and yet that blind faith that you say, you're gonna get through this, but you want for it to go away.
I thought I could find this quicker. Okay, I'll just have to do it from memory here, because I'm not finding it as quickly as I wanted to. But as you were talking about the support of leaders, certainly they look to Moses as their great leader, even as they grumbled against him and so forth. But think of the tribal culture, and he wasn't named chief, but it was that kind of a role, an elder, if you will, a presbyter. And as the one that they looked to, who they had an idea that went to God on their behalf, he was a priest. That's a priestly role, someone who is a go-between, goes to God on the people's behalf. So he had those roles. There's a story that was preached at my ordination. I'm sorry, my first installation at Kansas, when they installed me as pastor there. And the person that was giving the charge to the congregation, saying, okay, you're starting this new relationship. And the story that this person told was the story of Moses when the people were in battle. The army was in a battle, and Moses was the kind of the leader up on the hill surveying things and the big general, if you will. And they had such confidence in Moses and Moses' connection with God. Remember, their idea was the battlefield was the chess players, it was the powers above, God and so forth, doing the battle, and these were the instruments. And so they had such faith in Moses that when Moses, with the staff in one hand, would lift his hands and they could see from the battlefield, the battle turned in their favor. But the battle didn't go quickly. And if you've ever held something up for Moses' strength began to fail. He's like, I gotta take a rest here. And every time he put his arms down, whether they lost confidence, who knows, but the story is presented that the battle would turn back the other way. And so what was called upon is, they said, all right, you elders who are up here with Moses, come and hold up his arms. You be his strength. What a wonderful story. Whether it's literal or whether it's just purely metaphorical. Yes, you have leaders. Yes, they give you confidence, but that leader is not the be all end all. And that person is of limited strength and limited capacities. And so it will be with support that you can all achieve that together. I'm sorry I couldn't find the citation of that quickly. I thought I might be able to.
Thought on that though, that just my perception is, yes, he showed strength and everything, and it was a sign, because I'm thinking like in a classroom or something, and all the kids look to the teacher, you know, as the leader. But at some point, you want those children to go beyond you and to act on their own. I would want all those people to fight for the very best, because they too had God in their heart and they had the strength of God. It wasn't all about a human being, you know, right, wrong, positive, negative. He was a leader there to help them grow their faith. And it wasn't about the strength of his leadership. It was about how he could help model and grow their individual faith so that they could have gone and they could have been as strong as he was, simply because their faith in God had become, in essence, their faith. And they could stand on.
Wonderful. Okay, other thoughts on the parallels of how people are, how God is from the story of Moses and all of that period? We can move on unless there's someone else.
There was a lot of idolatry going on during that time. And I think that they all finally came together as one when they learned that God was the true God. And that Moses was trying to get them there, you know, so that they weren't believing in this idol and that idol and worshiping all these false idols, you know, that it was strength in one and the camaraderie that they had. So
Isn't it
to
something?
bring them together.
Renee brings an interesting point. What's weird is that then after a period of time, the faith quivered again. And then other people went another way to find something else that would get them to where they could gain.
Just because Moses
just
wasn't
because,
there,
yeah.
but he had to come back and bring them all
But
together.
even after Moses had died,
Right.
throughout the history of the Old Testament, you know, it was constant rival between God, our sovereign God, versus whether it was idolatry or picking another human. It never seemed to really sink into them to pass it on as legacy that this is God, this is how we do it, and we sustain that. Maybe I'm sure that's a way that it was meant to be, but when you look at it in the rearview mirror, it seems weird that people would choose that when they knew that God was such a powerful. But I guess we're that same way today.
We are that same way today. I think, you know, there's idolatry is alive and well.
Well, you beat me to the punch, because that's where I was going. You're good. I'm glad. It's better coming from all of you. My thought was, I was going to say, thank goodness idolatry only happened back in biblical times. Obviously not. So you make that point that it is an ongoing temptation. And I used to think, when I read the story of Pharaoh and I'm thinking, okay, well, I would have given in after one plague. But nobody could be that obstinate and stubborn.
Mhm.
And then in my life, I realized I can be that obstinate and stubborn. It may seem hyperbolic or exaggerated when we get those stories, but I learn about myself that way.
I'd like to say one other thing related to that, that idolatry is alive and well. However, today it's more subtle,
Okay,
much more
subtle forms. So let me pause on that, because I think it would be good for us to say, how do we define, or how do you define idolatry? We use the word, we know it from the Bible and other places, but is there a way that, how do you understand it? Can we articulate that?
Is it when something is so strong, it drives us, and you find you're worshiping it. You can't think of anything else, but everything is that focus on
Okay.
that.
So
Whereas
it's-
in the Bible, it used to be an obvious idol.
Okay,
Most often, I believe,
and
yeah.
so sometimes it's an object,
An object.
okay, but now it doesn't always have to be that.
Correct.
It's something that draws the focus or the worship.
It can even be a belief
Mhm.
system.
Yes,
Mhm.
okay. Any other ways that we summarize what idolatry means? How would you
We've
define
seen
it?
it in Tom Jones pops into my head. Is that the name of him with who's the guy with the, oh, shoot. Words are. It wasn't Tom Jones. Tom Jones
No,
is the
any
singer.
Are you talking about the cult leader?
The
The
cult,
cult leader,
Jim Jones.
Jim Jones.
Jim
Jones.
Jones.
Yeah.
Last
Yes.
one, right?
It's not unusual.
Another famous Jim.
I'll leave that.
Oh, it's idolatry.
I
Sorry.
don't like talking.
The Ethel's not laughing, so I guess I get
Yeah.
a very serious look on her face, so.
It can also be, I was gonna say, it can also be, putting materialistic things or money.
Okay,
Yes.
objects, materialism.
Mhm.
Did you have something coming on the tip of your tongue?
I was just thinking that it's when we put more energy and focus on something than we put energy and focus on God and God's will. Whether, yeah. That was my thought.
Very good. I think you're all on board with it. I think all of those things enhance our understanding. If you were taking a class on the essential tenets of the Reformed faith, which I'm going to review for us, one of them is the sin of idolatry. We believe that that still infects us today. And idolatry is defined as anything that we put in place of God. God should be the object of our devotion, our worship, our hope. And so when we place our trust and our hope in something other than God, it's idolatrous, and we are prone to that. And God knows that. And this story tells us that God not only knows that, but loves us in spite of that, and makes a way for us to come and repent, which means turn back to God. So
Wherever in the Bible, I don't, the word was probably not used, but were idolaters be considered to be, would they nowadays considered to be a cult?
I don't know when that cult terminology
I don't
may have
either.
come around. I'm sure it has a long history.
Oh, yeah.
And there are even some cultic is another word that actually are part of our tradition.
Mm.
So, and it's not necessarily a negative thing, as we understand, like the Jim Jones cult or a brainwashing or. This is off the subject, but I'm curious. Over the past several years, in the things that I hear on the news and on radio, I hear people using the term gaslighting. And I thought,
Yes.
what does that mean? And why is that now the big hot term that people use? And I think I read something this past weekend that, okay, because I like to know the origin of that,
Yeah.
to have it make sense. And I think I understand it now, but have you heard that term, or is it something you understand, or has it made you kind of, I get upset, like, who made this the big term and why did they get to
Yeah.
decide?
Yeah, no.
So what, how do you understand gaslighting?
I don't know what it means. I heard the term, but that's all.
Okay, yeah,
Kind of like brainwashing.
It is.
all right, okay, and that's
Making
very close,
believe
yeah.
Something that really.
Brainwashing.
Making believe it's something that isn't
Term of
there.
brainwashing.
In emotionally abusive relationships, it's when one party tries to convince the other party they don't know what they're talking about or
There you go.
thinking.
But that wouldn't be the definition of gaslighting, would it?
Well,
It's
so
manipulation.
It gets us there.
Manipulation.
It's
Okay.
brainwashing, manipulation.
Okay.
And it's that very thing, and the other big term that is misinformation, disinformation, that's all the big.
Right.
I never did that. I never said that.
The one thing that I thought that gaslighting is taking what Joanne said, but remembering Jim's, it is a intimidation, it's manipulation, it's a brainwashing, but it goes to a psychological aspect of the rationale
Well, this
is
is
to
fun.
take another person down to where that their belief now is what you have brainwashed them to.
It's a control.
I'm glad that I ran across this reading then, because it now seems like it's meant to be. The origin, if I have it correct, comes from literature or a play. A play from the times when there wasn't electrical power, but they had
That's
gas
correct.
lights. In fact, the house that I helped remodel was converted from gas lighting to electricity, but some of those old fixtures were still there. And so when houses were lit by gas, and you could turn it up or down, right? Well, the man manipulated and convinced his wife that she was insane by dimming the lights.
Oh, Ingrid Bergman.
Okay, is there, okay,
Doris Day.
would dim the lights, and then she would say,
Was in-
is it dim in here or is it me? And then he would convince her that it's you.
Yeah.
So that's emotional.
Right.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's all of those things. It's
Yeah.
brainwashing, it's misinformation, it's manipulation. So at least now when I hear the term, I think, oh, that's where that comes from.
This
Right.
too is alive and healthy.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And how are we susceptible to that? And who tries to tell us we're off base? And how susceptible am I to saying, well, it must be me?
Victims of the story.
Yeah. So that's really, I'm glad we have that little rabbit trail. Okay, so I'll make this, to me, this has been fruitful. If you need me to move on, I will. But Genesis, Exodus, what's the third book? Leviticus. Oh, we skipped one. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy. That's
I will
verse 5.
never forget that, because when I had to memorize books of the Bible for confirmation, they were typed on a sheet. And my stepmother, Jane, would quiz me, and I'd have to go through, and there was a typo on the sheet. And so I'd say Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and she'd say, not Numbers, Nubers. I will never forget Numbers. Numbers, Nubers. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Nomos is law. All right, so there's the nami part of Deuteronomy. And then you can figure out the first part, deut. What's that? Think of your French.
Two.
Un ten.
Second.
Un deux.
Second law.
Yeah.
So they, and it doesn't mean that it replaced the first law, but Deuteronomy is that expansion. So we get the 10 Commandments and people live, and so they have to codify and put into what they call the second law, Deuteronomy. And then that's where you get the food laws and the cleanliness laws and the Sabbath laws and all of those things that become a guide for people. But they are humanly interpreted, and so the law becomes more of a burden in some cases, or something that is hard to follow. And the law itself became an idol for the Pharisees. The Pharisees and others who adopt the idea that I can fulfill God's law perfectly. And that's what it takes. That's what God expects. And this is one of the things that developed into Pharisaism and the Essenes and all the other sects. The people who thought that to the absurdities of being upset with Jesus because he healed a woman on the Sabbath. And even in the Orthodox communities where, I guess to this day, the elevators stop on every floor because pushing the button on the Sabbath is considered doing something that's not. I mean, so it can be a burden, it can be absurd, and it wasn't meant to be. You know, it's Psalm 19, the law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. I'm going to try and talk about that Sunday. I never thought the law revived the soul. I thought the law was, when I had to read it, tedious and scary, and or that it was a burden. And so as I'm thinking of the 10 Commandments, all right, yeah, honor thy mother and father. Yeah, I guess I get that one. But remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Well, I want to build my whatever on the Sabbath. I want to do so. And so for me, it was, this is just another burden God's given us. We got to do this. And what did we get with the blue laws? Right? Car dealers couldn't be open. No storage, certain things you couldn't do. You couldn't go to the movies on a Sabbath. All these things that people interpreted that you're not keeping the day holy. And we make it into a burden. But think about when that was first given. Who were the 10 Commandments given to? The people who just escaped slavery, who were at the whim of the Pharaoh and had to work 24/7 whenever they were called on. And God says, take a day. Take a day. For them, it was not a burden, it was a release, a relief. Oh my gosh, you mean we don't have to be at God's beck and call or anybody else's 24/7? And there's this idea that comes back to me that the Sabbath isn't to limit me from doing all the fun things I want to do, but it does limit me from saying, you know what, you get into a mode where you think the whole world and this church or whatever can't get along without you. Take a day off and let me prove that the world can go without you. I mean, it's supposed to be a relief, a healthy understanding, and yes, it honors God, but not as a burden. So we get the second law. So there's your Torah, first 5 books of the Bible. And so we still look at that as the law, and it's also historically attributed that Moses was the author. Well, in modern times, we think of an author as someone who's written a book, published it, and got a copyright. All of that stuff was done orally. So Moses was involved. He was the subject. He generated things, but none of it was written down. And it evolved through time, through oral tradition. So it's kind of silly for us, which some people do, say, well, if you don't believe that the first 5 books of the Bible were written literally by God dictating it to Moses, then you're not Orthodox. That still happens. People still think that. And others will say, well, then how did Moses write the account of his own death? You know, it's absurd to do that. Yes, we attribute Moses to be integral to that. And traditionally we can say, yes, Moses was the author, but we understand it was not Moses, it was the community that gave us that. And God working through flawed people to give us something that would last and inform us. But it doesn't stop there. All right, so here we go. I just keep going to sleep, so I don't have it plugged in. Okay. That's it.
Yeah.
Why do I keep going to sleep? All right, so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy,
I'll say that.
and then we switch categories. Does anybody know what comes next? You can cheat and look up your index if you want. Begins with a J.
What they mean.
Who followed Moses as leader? Joshua.
Joshua.
So the next book chronicles the period under Joshua as leader. Right? And I use that word chronicles advisedly. Joshua, Judges is the next one. And it's the period of leaders that were called judges. not in robes to just hear cases and rule on the law, although they did that. They did settle disputes, but they were the chiefs, the leaders, the ralliers, the people that brought together the tribes to withstand enemies and all of that stuff. And there was a focal point. And it got away from Moses as the great priest prophet. And then, yeah, Joshua followed. But now after Joshua, there's a series of people. And so we have the book of Judges, and it talks about what happened and who the different judges that were leaders at the time, Samson and Barak and Deborah. So we have a female judge, which is amazing. And all the things that, and then finally the people get to a point where they say, well, our enemies are so much better organized because they've got a king. We need a king. And God says through the prophet, you don't want a king, that's going to lead to, and they insist. So he says, so he relents. And we get the first king, who is
So,
Saul. Say it again.
Saul.
Saul. King Saul. So Saul was anointed king and started out really well, but it ends tragically. I think he had some form of depression, dementia, some kind of mental illness. It really got bad, and maybe the stresses got to him, whatever it was. It's a tragic ending. Okay, so there was Saul, and then there was King David, and then there was Solomon, his son, and the kingly line continued. However, Solomon's son was the one under whom the kingdom split. Remember, the people of the northern part of Israel said, you know, Solomon got to a point where he was just really pushing us too hard. How will you be? He said to, I think it's Rehoboam, I may be wrong, Solomon's son. And he was a young man. So will you treat us a little better? Because, you know, that's what we're looking for. And he consulted with Solomon's wise advisors. And they said, yeah, you would be wise to listen to the people and back off. And then he went out for drinks with his buddies, his peers. And they said, oh, you're king. They have to do what you say. You know, so you need to make an impression. Why don't you go up there and tell them you thought my father was tough? You wait till you get a load of me. Did he listen to the wise counsel of his elders? Or did he listen to his peers?
His peers.
I'm using this as peer pressure example for any age group, teens included. And so everything that they thought they were striving for, the great kingdom that they thought, the promised land, poof. He exercised his poor judgment. The kingdom split, and it went downhill from there. And there was the exile and all of that. All right, so those stories come in after we get from Judges. And then we have that wonderful story of Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Samuel was the prophet. He was the anointer of Saul and David. So that goes through. Then we get these books called 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And those are historical accounts. Factual and narrative. Oral, tribal, you know, so you take it, but it brings the history across in a way that today we would say, well, if it's not completely factual, then we have to flag it. For them, it was, this is how we pass the story down. All right, so, and then we have these final books of Ezra, Nehemiah. And that's when the people were restored back from Babylon's exile, and they had a whole new set of challenges. So, all right, so now we've got this second section, which is chronicling or historical, mostly in nature, in how its origin came about. It's the oral and then written tradition of the people and how they functioned after it used to be Moses and then Joshua and then the judges and now the kings. And here's the history of how it went. So if the first 5 books are the law, the next section is, and I just said the word, begins with an H.
historical.
We look at as the history. The Jewish people lump it all in as the prophets. So they say the law and the prophets.
So if I may just say, so when we did read the Bible in a year, all the books were divided into those categories and then they go into others.
That's some of the rhyme and reason why it's put together the way it is.
Oh.
All right, so we move on then, and we get this book of Esther, which can be considered history. So that's kind of on the precipice. I think that's why it's put there. And then we have this strange book of Job, which I will argue, I believe not as historical fact, but as more of George Washington and the cherry tree. Truthful, but not necessarily factual. And you can disagree with that. But we get into Job. All right, and Ethel, I'm gonna put you on the spot. What's after Job? It's funny. Ethel spoke with her mic muted and Pam's voice came out.
Oh, I forgot I was unmuted. I'm sorry.
That's perfect. The timing was absolutely right on. So
They should do
when
that.
Ethel moves her mouth and Pam's voice comes out, both with the correct answer, Psalms. I know that when on prayer call, Ethel and others, when they're thumbing for Psalms and going back to, oh, I've gotten into Job. So Job's, Psalms, and then what comes after? Proverbs. Very good. And then there's this strange book called Ecclesiastes or Koheleth, which is a Hebrew word meaning teacher or wisdom. Koheleth. And so you might, I think in the Hebrew Bibles, it's still called Koheleth. It's not called Ecclesiastes, which is different from Ecclesiastics, confusingly, which is a part of the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha. It is a book, but it's not that same one. Ecclesiastes. It is related to ecclesia, the Greek word for church. So when Jesus said to Peter, upon this rock, Peter, Cephas, I will build my ecclesia, church. So Ecclesiastes is a forerunner of the word church. It's related to it, but that book is a wisdom book. It barely mentions God at all. It's presented as Solomon's reflections on, gosh, I've gone through all of this, and does it really mean anything? Vanity, all is vanity. So, and I have a friend who reads it every year because it grounds him. Some people look at it and say, this is too stark. It's not uplifting. Others find it different. So, all right, so we've got Ecclesiastes, and then this other interesting book, Song of Solomon, that almost never gets studied. And its reputation is such that it's a romance book. It's actually from biblical times considered quite graphic about human relations and how men and women relate together in a sexual and romantic, erotic way. And then it somehow crosses over into an awkward metaphor for how God knows us intimately. And so we kind of look at that and say, okay, that's probably a book I'm not going to spend a lot of time with. How many of you have read anything in Song of Solomon in the last 5 years? We just
read the Bible.
We read the Bible, so we.
all right, so you, all right, we had to.
Ethel's got a big grin on her face.
Actually, she's blushing.
Well, and so Dr. Ray Martin, one of my great, the late wonderful Ray Martin, who opened the Bible to me, was one of the people that God used to open the Bible to me for the first time in seminary. And he was brilliant and he was humble and made fun of himself. And he was well into his late 80s and teaching professor emerita, and I just ate up everything I could from him. And when he was growing up, very strict Lutheran, and he became a Lutheran pastor. And he said, when I married Alice, his wife, he said, in order to be proper and holy on our honeymoon, he said, we need to read the Bible. And so he said, but it's our honeymoon. So he started to read from Song of Solomon.
I wonder,
That was a wise man.
Bob would always say when it came up to something of knowing me and if we know each other in the biblical sense. Oh, whether,
Right.
but he was a Bible reader.
Well, and we can laugh about it. We can be squeamish about it.
Wow.
But that word knowledge I mean, I even remember Sunday school stories when what's your favorite Bible verse? And the little kid would snicker and say, Adam knew his wife. And it's the Bible way of saying these things that are perfectly intended and real in human existence.
Of course not.
But remember that Jesus' definition of eternal life, to know God and to be known by him. Think not of sexual intimacy, but think of that oneness that's intended. And so we kind of lose that by shying away from, we can't talk about those X-rated subjects, but we may lose that. Patty,
But in the New Living Translation, it's called Song of Songs.
Song of Songs,
Song of
yes,
Songs,
yeah.
yeah.
Yes, so thank you for that. Yeah, some refer to it as Song of Songs. And you'll have to give a report on why that is, because I don't know. All right, so anyway, Dr. Martin said, so I've read from Song of Solomon. I didn't, and then he paused for a little bit and said, don't do that on your honeymoon.
Yeah, sorry.
Please know what she's missed.
So, and as you hear, the language is just too archaic for us as he's describing his love. And I look at Chris and I say, I'm going to read to you how I feel about you. Oh, your nose are like the cedars of Lebanon. It's just, it's unbelievable. So anyway, all right, so it's nice that we have an understanding of that. So we've gotten this next section, which we call wisdom literature. So that's what this is from, and you can argue whether Esther and Job should be in history or if they should be in wisdom. They're on the precipice. So some people might consider them part of the history section, some might consider them wisdom. But definitely when you get into Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, we are definitely into what's called wisdom literature. And Emmy Platt, who was another Old Testament professor, said that much of the wisdom literature was collected and compiled, even though some of the Psalms go way back to King David. Much of it was collected in the form we have it during the exile. When the people had lost their ability to worship in Jerusalem, were sent off to Babylon, were crushed and defeated, and they were left trying to ask the question, why did this happen? What do we do now? We've got all this history. What's the point? And you can almost see in Koheleth, what's the point? Why did all this happen if it didn't come out the way we thought? The Psalms were compiled at that time. The Proverbs, this is what we remember from what Solomon said. This is what we remember from our wisdom. This is what's been passed down. Let's put it all together. And why, Emmy Platt said, God had a purpose for the people being in exile among the unclean out of their holy land. And the way her phrase was, this is when God's people learn to hack it in the real world. So they were kind of cloistered up until that time, especially the time of the kingdom, thought of themselves as the chosen people, started to say, these are unclean, we're selected. And they couldn't, some of them they certainly wouldn't eat with a Gentile. And this you can see in Jesus' times. Some of them wouldn't come under the roof when Pilate was trying Jesus. The Pharisees wouldn't come into his courtyard. They stood outside because it was unclean. So they still had this idea of separateness, but for those that couldn't be separate anymore, they had to go to Babylon and they had to subsist. This helped them get through, and they compiled it and learned how to hack it in the real world. That was Emmy Platt's way of saying it. So I'm honoring my professors. Hopefully that's helping you, I'm not sure. So now we have law, history, wisdom, and then we get into the next section, which is easy for you to name.
Isaiah.
Somebody said it. Oh, well, Isaiah is what? One of the, prophets. All right, so you'll hear oftentimes in the Jewish tradition, the whole Old Testament is summed up by saying the law and the prophets. Right? We can get more specific and say the law, history, wisdom, and prophets. And there are your four major sections. And you have the major prophets, which each take up one scroll. They're so long, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then you have this smaller book that's attributed to Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, called Lamentations. Some of the lowest lows, but also some of the most beautiful things. Proverbs 3 is amazing in how it talks about the lowest of lows humanity can reach. But this I call to mind. God's love never fails. God's mercies are fresh and new every morning. And I have hope. So even in Lamentations, there is hope. So there's a little section that doesn't really fall with the major prophets or the minor prophets. And then we get into, which I to this day cannot, if you said, name for me all of the 12 minor prophets, I'll get 8 and say, oh, or I can't do it. I got them in order that one time, but that was my 8th grade brain. Now, so we have the minor prophets, and I'll go through them. Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum. I learned when I was in Mexico, I used to say Nahum.
Right.
Nahum. I met a child named Nahum in Mexico. Nahum is how I say it now. Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and there we have the prophets. Okay, what have we learned here? This is an orientation for you of the whole of the Old Testament. And we reflected on one major story of it. At one point, I would like to reflect on Joseph and when he was sold into slavery and the whole ordeal of his life and what that means for persistence. So let me give you a choice now. Having done that and just done a little review and a little quizzing on that, are you game for now looking at the story of Joseph and doing it similar to what we did with Moses? What does this say about people? What does it say about God? What does it inform us, or how does it inform us? Are you interested in moving with that exercise, or do you want to switch gears entirely? I have another piece that I can't, so.
Wherever you want, it's fine by me.
I am the dictator.
Like, think about Joseph.
All right, yes, we're okay moving into Joseph. Okay,
I have a quick question. Does history start with Joshua?
yes,
Okay.
yeah, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, yes.
Excuse my ignorance, I never can remember the difference between the major and the minor prophet.
Okay, major means wordy like Pastor Jim. Long-winded.
Oh, okay.
It just means they wrote so prolifically. And Isaiah takes up one whole scroll.
Understood.
Ezekiel takes up one whole scroll.
Okay.
Jeremiah takes up one whole scroll. The other prophets were minor, not because they were less important, but
That's
because
what
we
I
have
meant.
less recorded.
I got it,
And you
okay.
can fit all 12 prophets on one scroll.
Okay.
So that's good to clarify.
Understood, thank you.
All right, so let's do a little reading here. If we get to Genesis 39. Do you want to open up? So we're skipping big parts of the story, hoping that you at least are vaguely familiar with them. Joseph had these dreams and he braggadociously shared them with his brothers about how he saw the stalks and the others were bowing to them. And he said, well, hey, yeah, one day you will bow to me. And then Joseph was favored by his father and he gave him the coat of many colors. So the brothers were terribly jealous. And so we know the story that when they were all out together one day in the wilderness, they came up with a plan to get rid of him. And one suggested, well, let's just kill him. And the other said, well, we can't do that. But we could sell him into slavery and say that he got killed. And so that's what they chose to do. And so some nomads came along, they sold him into slavery, off he went to Egypt. And then they took some blood of, I can't remember, a lamb or something, and soaked his coat in it. And they went back to the father and said, oh, Joseph was killed by a terrible beast. And there you go. How black in your hearts can you get? To sell your brother out,
Down low.
out of jealousy, and then break your father's heart and everybody else who loved him. And then just go on like, well, you know, that's just a terrible
Lots of
thing.
animals,
Having
but
sold him into
animals
slavery,
in that thing.
you can wipe your hands.
They would use counseling.
Yes, they could.
Oh, the things the human heart is capable of. So, all right, so we join Joseph now in chapter 39. Would someone like to read? And I'll just keep going until my arms get tired.
Joseph.
When Joseph was taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders, he was purchased by Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. Am I saying that name right?
Yes.
Okay. Potiphar was captain of the guard for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come and sleep with me," she demanded. But Joseph said, "Look," he told her. But Joseph refused. "Look," he told her, "my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. One day, however, no one else was around when he went to do his work. She came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, "Come on, sleep with me." Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. When she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants. Soon all the men came running. "Look," she said, "my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream, he ran outside and got away, but he left his cloak behind with me."
What a
She-
little tart.
Yeah.
Okay.
She kept the cloak with her until her husband came home. Then she told him her story. "That Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me." Went from rape to fooling around. She said, "But when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak with me." Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held. And there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed.
Okay, so there's chapter 39, a good succinct piece of the story of Joseph. And I'll just summarize to you what happened afterwards. Joseph had considered that his brothers sold him out to slavery, that he'd lost everything, that how could God do such a thing? And then he thought things were turning up, and then this woman accuses him falsely, and he gets thrown into prison. So he says, "Forget it, God, I'm done with you." The end. None of you are going to say, "Baloney." That's not how the story goes. All right, let's, without having to read on, how instead, I might have pouted and said, "Well, I guess there's no God." I may have become bitter and said, "Well, how could God let this happen?" I look to Joseph and what Joseph ended up doing as a different response. So fill in what you know about how Joseph responded. It started to hint there.
He was successful, and then he was chosen to interpret dreams because the leader Pharaoh king, the king, wanted his dreams interpreted. And he was known to do that. And then he became favored with the king. And there he got out and he was in charge of multiple things. And he helped with everything to make the king successful. And that's when the brothers then, when all the food and everything was getting less, they came because they needed food. And he noticed his brothers right away. And they did not know who he was. Yeah.
What a story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, just remarkable. And I would point out that when he was thrown into prison, falsely accused, could you imagine a lower low?
No.
And what is the next
Especially when you know
line?
you're innocent.
When he was in his lowest time that we can imagine? The next line is, but God had favor on him. He was God's favorite. He was favored by God at that time.
You didn't
Yeah,
know
and
that.
I would be, well, you could show it a little differently, God, you know, I'm in prison here and this, but that's on purpose. To show that at the very worst that could happen, it wasn't, oh, he must be cursed because he's sinful and bad and whatever. No, even in spite of that, God favored him. That was a way of saying it's not just your circumstances. If you have leprosy, God must think you're a sinner. Or if you're thrown in prison, no. You never know.
That's why when Pam was reading the list of the people who had persevered and their love for God had grown, he was used as an example because I can't imagine, there's nothing worse than to have their integrity questioned and to have that. And then he was, he was getting everything, everything was coming to him. He was prospering. And then all of a sudden something happened and he went down and he was just like a roller coaster in the way he did things. And yet he ended up, everything went well, but it was always about someone learning a lesson through him by his journey to God.
Other reflections now, what this story says about God, what it says about people. In
Says a
this
lot
case,
about Joseph forgiving his
Joseph or
brothers.
others. Okay.
Oh,
What it
yeah.
says about our interactions and how it guides us. And what are your reflections?
Human element, to have your family treat you like that and put you in a hole for dead because they were jealous. He was such a good person to forgive his brothers and to go back. Yeah.
There was reconciliation even after that.
Mhm.
Okay. Other things that give us guidance from this story.
Well, then he tested him some because he put the cup in Benjamin's bag, said it.
Oh, that he was a thief. That's
Yeah.
right.
Okay. You were going to say something?
The integrity of. What was I going to say?
Uh-oh, sorry.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, Jim.
me.
Well, it was not funny exactly, but when the verse 10 said that though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. The description down here below says, though she spoke to Joseph day after day, it says Samson twice succumbed under similar pressure.
So they wanted to point out that
Yeah,
not everybody had the fortitude
yeah.
of Joseph. Okay.
So his integrity despite his station in life, I guess, or how we, I think that's right.
Okay.
Well, when he told his brothers, he like not only forgave them, but told them it wasn't their fault. God needed him to do this purpose for that. God used him to then up saving, having went through the famines and have all the food to save people. So he put it to God that they're fine. This was God's doing.
That's amazing. And Ethel, whenever Pam talks, can you move your mouth? That, Pam, that brings out one of maybe the most poignant perspectives, godly perspectives in all of Scripture. When even Joseph's brothers were amazed at his forgiveness, and Joseph summed it up by saying, "You intended it for evil, but God intended it for good." Now, God didn't make it happen, I don't believe. He didn't make the brothers do such an evil thing, but God knew that was what they were capable of. He repurposed it. It just took a long time, and it took someone who was the ultimate, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. Joseph, to me, is the ultimate hero in that.
Yeah.
Is that where take the high road? You know, because that's exactly what he did. He took the high road and his faith was telling him, this is what I will do. This is what I
Yeah.
need to do. Take the high road.
What an example.
Yeah, really.
I fall short of it still. I have to be reminded.
How many years was it from when they sold him until the brothers came to get their food and?
See, all is right with the world because Patty is the one supposed to ask me questions I don't know the answer to. And that's number 2 today. So I feel like everything is good. And I really don't have a time frame.
Okay.
It might be an easy found answer on the Google machine if Renee's up to it. I'm not sure. But I will just be honest and say I'm not aware. But it's a good question. But yeah, I will say it was probably an excruciatingly long time from my perspective. Any time would be a long time in prison for those situations and for being sold out. Okay. Other reflections on what a story like this tells us
When he
about
went
God?
to Sarah, the king of Egypt, he was 30.
There you go.
So that happened very early.
Okay,
Good, thank you.
so that gives some perspective on the timing, but thank you. Other reflections before I bring it to a close?
So I guess they had to have time for it to build up the king's food stores, and all that. It wasn't that, and that was one of his dreams is that you're gonna, you're gonna have to.
Yeah, amazing that he had that foresight, that leadership, that connection with God, and how God repurposed something that we would have looked at from one perspective saying, well, that's horrible. How could a God allow that? God wasn't orchestrating that, but God was saying, okay, I'm going to make something of this that will become a shining example of how people can take the high road when that just seems impossible.
He was in prison for 2 years or thereabouts before all this was happening or something like that.
Something like that. My son was especially proud of this play, Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten, because he had toward the end a scene. Each one of the people in the ensemble had a scene kind of to themselves. And he had one where I actually illegally recorded it and I'm admitting it online, so they'll come to take me away soon.
Take away your phone.
And he said, I recently bought a grave plot for myself. I said, a grave.
Great,
He said, that's a strange real estate transaction. I mean, what's the basics about real estate? Location, location, location. But what's the point? What difference would a view make from a grave? And you certainly don't have to worry about resale value.
Right.
So, but then he said, but I made the purchase, and he said, well, I thought I'd go scope it out. So he took a blanket, laid it out, and I lay down on the place of my grave. And I looked up and I saw the stars. And I realized the view. And then he talked about the stars that began sending their light that he was now seeing long before his birth. And how some of those stars have died, but their light still continues on.
Mhm.
And so so he stands up and he's looking and they've got the disco ball and all the twinkling and everything. And then the rest of the cast comes on with the starlight shining down on them. And his thought lingering of, even after the death of the star, the light shines on. And so that was what he was contemplating. And then he went into a story that I have preached at least twice. I think I've preached it here for a third time. And that is the story of on the Isle of Crete. When in the play it said, are there any questions? The voice of God came over and they put it up on the screen. Are there any questions? And someone said, what is the meaning of life? Does anybody know where I'm going with this? Okay. On the Isle of Crete, one of the characters said, and then she assumed the role of a student. She said, there is a place for the reconciliation of warring peoples, the German Nazis and the people of Crete, who had the most bitter experience, because when the German paratroopers came, the people of Crete, the peasants, came out and they resisted them with pitchforks, with hay scythes, with whatever they could find, with a rolling pin. And there was a terrible battle. And because of these people doing this to Hitler's finest, they lined up whole villages and executed them and threw them into mass graves. And there is a cross that marks the mass graves on one end of the valley there. And on the other, there is an iron cross with the regimented burials of all the Nazis who died there. Here they are. And a young boy by the name of Papaderos, Alexander Papaderos, was he was teaching a class one day at this institute that he founded. He founded an institute for reconciliation. He said, you know, I've discovered that the Cretans and the Germans, they have a lot to learn from one another. And in the most unlikely of places, in the view of these two crosses, he founded a humble and fragile institute for healing and peace, especially between those two people, but it continues on for all people. Even after that bitterness, to call for reconciliation. And apparently he was teaching a seminar or something. This is a true story. And one of the students at the end of class, like you do in college, are there any questions? And most people are ready to back up and go. And somebody, as a joke, said, well, yeah, what's the meaning of life? Ha ha, everybody laughs and gets ready to go. Papaderos holds up his hand and says, well, wait, I'll answer. He takes out his wallet, and from his wallet, he takes a small piece of glass. It's a mirror. It's a piece of a mirror. He said, I've carried with this with me since I was a young boy, because I came upon the site of a German motorcycle that had crashed. And the mirror had broken into many pieces. And I thought first, well, I'll try and reassemble it. That was his. He said it wasn't possible. So I took the largest piece and I smoothed it on the rocks until it could hold it. And for me as a young boy, I noticed that it reflected the light. And so I used to, when I was bored or whatever, I didn't have a lot of toys or anything, I used it as a toy. And so when there was light and I saw, oh, there's a hole that light never goes into, I would shine light into a place that it didn't otherwise go. And I would shine a light into this crack or onto this place. And for him, that became a game. Where can I shine the light that it wouldn't otherwise go? And he said, that's the meaning of my life. I'm not the light. I'm not the source of light. But there is light. And I can pick up the pieces. And perhaps I can shine the light into a dark place where it wouldn't otherwise go. I can shine the light into the dark places in men's hearts, is how they say it in the old archaic patriarchal language, human hearts. That's the meaning of life. I had preached that at least twice, and using mirrors. Maybe I haven't done it here because I actually get a mirror out like they did, and they started shining it on us in the audience. And so that was such a fitting story to end with. And Jacob, said, did you get that, Dad?
No.
He was really proud that he did that scene. So and Chris said yes, he did, because while we watched it the first time, and he said, when the woman said Alexander, and I said with her without saying it out loud, Papaderos. So she knew I was right there with him. And in Muskegon, I embarrassed myself because I was watching too much political TV. And when I told the story, I mistakenly said Papadopoulos. I corrected myself later. Okay, so, all right, that is an example as we come to a close of Pastor Jim flying by the seat of his pants for Bible study. My plan that I had tried to come up with.
Very good.
So, well, all right, if it worked, great, I'm very happy. If you need to privately somehow tell me, please prepare better next time. You can do that. Okay, I'm gonna pause the recording here. And for those of you that are willing to linger a minute or two here, let me ask about going forward.